think it's very confusing to be frum. I think it's really confusing. You know, we have a Torah, and it's got really some marvelous things in it that teach us and guide us. And then, you know, we hear about 12 steps, and then we hear about therapy. And, you know, deep down, like if we're honest with ourselves, it presents a bit of a conflict. Because, and many people who work 12 steps will definitely tell you this, that in a part of their recovery, you know, they begin to rediscover spirituality in a very different way. And one of the classic tensions of spirituality versus halacha is the fact that halacha becomes somewhat less relevant when you have a spiritual piece to it, right? Because the question is, if you focus on the meaning of what you're doing, at what point does the meaning overtake the letter of the law and the function of what you're doing? But if you focus on the letter of the law and the function of what you're doing, sometimes the spiritual pieces become meaningless. And so there is, throughout Jewish history, actually, it's a pattern that repeats itself of the tension between the letter of the law and between spiritual meaning. And you know, you could trace it. You could read the Chovos HaLevavos, where he talks about in the beginning that people who talk about Mussar and spirituality, we're talking about now the 12th century, right? People talk about Mussar and spirituality, they think that they're foolish and they're simpletons, because, you know, the deep thing is to understand the halacha. And that's a tension, and then you could argue that that kind of tension repeated itself when different type of Kabbalistic movements made themselves more public and became more consumed by the masses with the probably with, you know, with the Arizal and the mystics of Tzfat, and then again with Hasidus versus Misnagdisha thinking, and probably today, you know, again, but it's a very powerful tension that exists, because if you stay very connected to the letter of the law, you might end up in some kind of crazy reductio ad absurdum, right, where some people complain, what am I doing, you know, learning Gemara all day long? It's just about, you know, whose cow is stuck in whose field. And then you have people that are, you know, very engaged in all these big spiritual pursuits, but, you know, they don't really necessarily know a lot about what the Torah has to offer. So it's very confusing. And people that have struggled their whole lives, or a portion of their lives, with very serious personal problems and character defects, and then they get help from some source that's outside of the Torah, it's really a polemical issue. It's not just a little interesting fact. It's why, you know, wasn't the Torah able to help me? You know, why is it that the 12 steps, which it could be that the people that were involved in it had some degree of Ruach HaKodesh, who really knows? It's certainly very powerful when you read them, but it certainly didn't come through the regular channels to, you know, to Judaism. And in fact, you know, there are groups that try to create Jewish 12 steps, whatever that means, and maybe they're successful, I don't know. But even if they are, what's the difference? I mean, it's still a, you know, a Chinese, Taiwanese knockoff, you know, a clone product. So what's the difference? You know, why was that necessary in the first place? And it's one of those things that people really wrestle with. So I thought that I would talk a little bit today about some of the similarities, but also the differences, what each approach might have to offer. And one of the other things I think that's very confusing too is, where does culpability begin? Where does personal responsibility begin when we know, at least many of us do from experience, that there are compulsions that are so strong that they're really almost impossible to resist. For addicts in certain situations, they really are not able to resist their compulsions. You know, and I've heard poskim declare that as such also. So, like, what's that all about, right? So so as a person, do they have a disease, right? It's one thing to say that you follow a disease model. That's very nice. But do they actually have a disease, that they're powerless to the effects of their disease? And then what does will have to do? And then where is Mussar, and where is the Menschlichkeit? And if every time everybody does something wrong, you know, it's just a disease, and it's just a problem, and it's not their fault because they have this bad situation in life or that bad situation in life, so why does anybody have to take responsibility for anything? So these are very confusing questions. And with the advent of, with the recognition of the frum community of the benefits of certain kinds of psychological approaches and thinking and interventions, it raises the conflict, that much higher, because when we were maybe living more simplistically, we didn't really pay attention to that idea. We assumed that people made moral choices, and immoral behavior, like things that today might be called a sexual addiction, we said was immoral behavior, period. We didn't say, oh, this person, is traumatized or was abused or whatever it is. We just said, hey, these guys are immoral. And so it really, it's not simple. So now that we've absorbed and we've seen, you can't fight, well, you could try to fight reality if you want to. It's just not very fruitful, but we try to fight reality often. But I'm just saying, you really can't argue with the reality that psychological approaches have helped many people. And sometimes those psychological approaches seem to be, to a degree, at odds with what we were originally taught. We come from a fairly authoritarian tradition. I mean, I know it's uncomfortable, right, because it's not either really fits with our democratic values and how we see ourselves in the modern world, but you really don't have to go more than 2 or 3 psukim, well, I should say 2 or 3 prakim, where somebody isn't getting punished, smitten, plagued, killed, castigated, hung, stoned, burned at the stake. I mean, I don't make the news, I only report it, right? This is our heritage. It is there. Yes, there are a lot of beautiful things, and perhaps that's also beautiful in its way. But I'm just saying there are things that are more apparently beautiful when we read the Torah, and apparently more inspirational, but it's there, right? So we're used to a very authoritarian tradition where people are punished and they're told what to do, and it's their fault, and they have to bear responsibility for their decisions, and then all of a sudden we come along, no, you have to be nice, you have to show acceptance and unconditional love. This is just all very confusing. So I want to talk a little bit, obviously I can't answer all those questions, but I wanted to talk a little bit about that and give some kind of perspective around these issues, because I think deep down it does present problems, and if it creates a conflict, it interferes with people's ability to be, committed to living either in recovery or living according to the Torah or both. So, one of the things that I think we do tend to fall, one of the traps that we fall into is some kind of black and white absolutist thinking. And so it's a lot easier to put something in a box and file it away than stay with questions and stay with things that we don't fully understand. And so our tendency is sometimes to take intellectual shortcuts and just want to put something in a box. So oftentimes I'll be working with somebody whose spouse or family describes him as a sex addict. And, well, why is he a sex addict? Well, because he's looking at all these things, that he shouldn't be looking at. And what's the problem with that? Well, it's forbidden. So now we have a tautology, right? Because it's forbidden and he's doing it, well, he must be crazy. So if he's crazy, he must be an addict, because that's a good explanation for why he's doing what he's doing, right? And so everybody that comes in, it's a lot easier to say the person's an addict than to say that he's just maybe not such a nice person. Maybe he's a narcissist. I'm not saying that there aren't people that really are in the throes of addiction. I'm just saying that it's very easy to be simplistic and assume that, well, he's an addict. So then all of a sudden we have a label, we put it in a box, and we can go ahead and live our merry lives and not ask any very deep philosophical questions. But the truth is that some people are not addicts. They just have schlechten midos. They're narcissists. Oh, but there's a diagnosis for that too, right? We called it a narcissistic personality disorder. Now that we have a diagnosis for that, we again don't have to worry about the problem. But the truth is that many people with narcissistic personality disorders have lousy midos, and it's a result of very poor moral choices that they've made. That's the reality. One of my favorite professors used to say that just because your mother hated you doesn't mean you had to believe her. Right? So the point that he was trying to make is that, yes, we can grow up in very challenging environments, and some of those environments might work substantially against our success and our welfare. But that's very different than saying that we don't have moral responsibility for our choices. It's also true that the aggregate of choices can eventually put a person in a position where they're effectively powerless, in the same way that a person, might be lost in a maze where, in theory, there's a way out. There is nothing tangible stopping a person who's lost in a maze from getting out of the maze. But on a practical level, they may not possess the intelligence or the tools or the patience to get out of the maze, right? The Meshil Sharm says that also in his Hakdama. He talks about that there's that the royalty used to have these giant mazes they built on their property, for entertainment, but some of the people would sit on a perch high up and they'd be able to watch everybody. So the person from the perch would see exactly which way to go, and it was all great sport to watch the other people wander around the maze. And he was saying, like, Mussar is like that it's telling you, it's telling you which way to go. You feel lost, but it's telling you which way to go. If you'd follow the directions from the person who's on top of the perch, you would get out of the maze. But the reality is that the aggregate of some very poor choices, sometimes amounting to years and years, if not decades of poor choices, can lead people to feel, effectively very, very lost. And on the flip side, right, not taking away from the point that I just made about moral responsibility, on the flip side, there really is such a thing as experiencing extremely strong compulsions that effectively the person's not just weak-willed or lazy, the person is really powerless. And addictions are referred to as cunning and baffling and powerful diseases. And if you've seen a real addict in action, you can see that is, that's a piece of it, right? But that doesn't necessarily absolve a person of moral responsibility, because even an addict, right, can have moments of sanity. Even an addict can make certain choices when they're in different phases. So I wanted to just give sort of that background first to say this is a very complicated issue, and we can talk a little bit about pieces of this. I don't know how much was spoken about the behavioral signs of addiction. In other words, how do you actually determine, not that any of us can fully determine anything about anybody else, but what would make one reasonably suspicious and confident that either they, through their own self, recognition, or a loved one is an addict? Was that discussed here in any depth? Oh, great. Well, now I have what to talk about. Otherwise, I was just going to have to tell jokes. Okay, good. So let's talk about some basic ideas. And again, when it comes to mental illness, there is, except for perhaps certain very specific, sorry about that, keep reminding me, certain very specific, clear criteria, most of it is, in a certain sense, it's based on convention. It's based on our agreement, what we consider to be healthy and adaptive, and what we don't. So it's not like it's written in stone. It's not like you could take a slide or and do a strep test and say, oh, this person is really sick. This person is really an addict. I think that's really overreaching. And in point of fact, even with regular medicine, it's very tricky, because even when you, let's say, do a throat culture and you find out that the person has strep throat and you prescribe antibiotics and the person is cured from that particular bout of strep throat, that doesn't really tell you why the person got sick. And that doesn't really tell you what the person may need to do to not get sick again. So I'm just saying that even in physical medicine, I think the issue is very complicated, and certainly with things that are much more intangible, like attitudes and thought processes, it's not so simple. But with that Hakdama, having said that, we do agree on some basic ideas. So let's talk about what are some of the behavioral signs of addiction, with all due humility that we're not here to diagnose other people. Even when we diagnose other people, we're not really here to diagnose other people. At least that's how I feel. But in any case, some of the signs are the person is obsessed with a substance or an activity, and they think about it constantly. Now, what I mean by an activity is because addictions are not only about chemical processes, right? They could be, gambling or looking at porn or other things where it could be that there is a neurochemical thing that's going on when they're in the throes of their addiction, but the fact is the actual thing that they're involved in is a process, it's an activity, it's not a chemical. The second sign, so there's an obsession with it, a constant thinking about it. The person will do this behavior or activity or ingest this substance despite serious danger and serious disability, meaning what they're doing, in some way is putting them in a lot of danger, right? So let's just talk about the secular world, right? Where there's no particular person has no particular moral imperative, does not feel that there's anything particularly wrong or right about porn, let's say, right? So that's okay, the person wants to look at porn, but if they're looking at porn at work for an hour a day, right, there's something wrong there, because that's not what you do at work for a whole host of reasons, right? And a person could easily lose their job, but it's more than just about losing their job, it's overtaking their life. So when a person engages in this activity and it's impairing social function or putting them at very serious risk, that's a telltale sign that there's something compulsive here that's happening that's much bigger than just a preference. That's not about a morality anymore, right? Another hallmark is the person at times will genuinely want to quit and attempt to quit, but still won't be able to, right? Now, it's a little bit self-referential, but that's still important, right? There's a part of the behavior the person doesn't want, or at times the person doesn't want that behavior and is still stuck doing that behavior, despite their attempt, despite swearing off of it. That's a very interesting sign. The person tries to moderate and control the behavior and doesn't succeed, right? So I'll just look at one picture. I'll just have one drink, right? So someone who's not in the throes of their addiction might be able to have a drink and stop. Oh, that was a nice drink. Feels good. I'm a little high. I'm at a Simcha. I'm enjoying myself. Why not? Nothing wrong with that. Yain yisamach levav enosh, right? Nothing wrong with that, right? But for an addict, somehow or another, it can be that they'll take one and really think they're just going to take one and they won't be able to stop. They'll say, okay, I'm not really going to look at porn. I'm just going to go, onto YouTube and look at some really interesting science videos, right? And then they start. And then, well, I'll just click on that, but I won't do anything else. And before you know it, they're stuck. So that's a sign, again, of a behavior that's out of control. The person hides their behavior, right? If the behavior is normal, if there's no conflict with this behavior, why are you hiding it, right? Obviously, there's something that's problematic about the behavior. And there's another sign, very interesting, is that there is a big gap, and I heard Lou was talking about this before also. There's a very big gap between the way the person's loved ones and family perceive the harm of this behavior versus what the person themselves perceives. So again, any one of these signs alone are not enough, but these are pretty good telltales, right? You have a problem, right, if everybody around you thinks that what you're doing is extremely destructive or dangerous, and you think it's just fine. Like, the joke about the lady calls up this guy, and she calls up her husband and says, I heard on the news there's this old man, he's driving one way, the wrong way on the highway, and he goes, yeah, there's 100 others too. I don't know what's going on, right? So, there's a problem if everybody thinks that there's a problem, and you don't think that there's a problem. That might be a problem too, right? So when there's a very big gap between people's perception of the danger of the activity versus what the person themselves says. So I get drunk Friday night. So I get a couple of drinks. Big deal. Yeah, but last week, you tripped and you fell while you're holding our 2-year-old son. It happens. Accidents happen, right? That's a sign that there's some kind of gap here between, what the people are thinking versus what this person is willing to admit to themselves. So if you want to shorten it all, if you want to do a self-test, whether you have an addiction or not, think about these 3 questions. Do I have a sense that I've lost control over whether or not I engage in any specific behavior? Am I experiencing significant consequences because of this out-of-control behavior? Do I feel like I'm constantly thinking about my specific out-of-control behavior even when I don't want to? So if you want the so to speak, the Cliff Notes version, if you answer those 3 questions, in a way that indicates you're having a problem, you probably are having some kind of problem. Yes, I'll be glad to. Let me make sure I get it right. Do I have a sense that I've lost control over whether or not I engage in a specific behavior? Right? Do I feel that I don't have control over this behavior? That's number 1. Number 2, am I experiencing significant consequences from this behavior? Right? So if I like to have a drink Friday night, and I go to sleep after the Seder, and I have a nice sleep, and I wake up in the morning, and I go to shul, and everything's fine, big deal, right? But if I wake up in the morning, I find out that my wife is furious at me because I said some really inappropriate things, right? And I wake up 3 hours later than I'm supposed to, right? Then you begin to see some serious consequences for this behavior, right? So those are things you have to question. The third thing is, do I feel like I'm constantly thinking about this out-of-control behavior even when I don't want to? Do I find myself thinking about this out-of-control behavior even when I don't want to? Right? So those are very important questions to ask yourself. Now, what is, so to speak, the cause of addiction? So there could be all kinds of theories. Maybe none of them are right. Maybe none of them are right, but we know the behaviors and we know what helps. Nevertheless, I think that it'd be fair to say that one important part of what makes an addiction is that the person who experiences the addiction has somehow or another, maybe even accidentally, come upon an experience that alleviates them of some incredibly oppressive, torturous internal pain. What that terrible pain is might vary from person to person or from addict to addict, but somehow or another, through the course of life, they stumbled upon something that was so powerful that it made them feel at that moment whole. So some alcoholics will speak about being so shy, and whenever they drank, they were able to be more social and connect to people. And some people will talk about being very anxious, and others will find just the depression of their life was so horrible, and the only time they could forget that, that pain is when they were in their place. So that's actually, so if that's good, what's the problem? Sounds like a good cure to me, right? Just smoke up a little weed and feel better. Soon it'll be legal before you turn around, like many other immoral things. Why not, right? So why not? Well, the answer is, again, what really works. What happens oftentimes when you're involved in an addictive process instead of a growth process is that it only temporarily alleviates the suffering. And 2 things happen. Number 1 is the suffering comes back. But number 2, far worse, is that tolerance builds. Right? So tolerance is one of the signs of addiction too, meaning you need more and more or more intensity of the same process or the same substance, right, to get the same result. And so eventually, and that's what's dangerous about certain opiates, because the body builds up a tolerance toward it, and they can take more and more of those opiates and reach a point where it's at an extreme level of toxicity. And sometimes also, I'm sure you've heard of people who had been, so to speak, sober for many months, and then all of a sudden they tragically die of an overdose. The reason why that happens is because they're used to a much higher dose psychologically, but physiologically, their body is not used to that high dose anymore. And so they take what was their hit 6 months ago, and it effectively basically kills them. And so these are very complicated issues, but tolerance is an important part of our addiction. So when you understand that yes, in theory, if these fixes worked, medicinal marijuana, for example, or whatever, right? If these fixes worked, maybe they'd have some legitimacy. But the problem with an addict is that for some reason, the way they orbit their problem and their process and their substance, it does not work. It creates too many problems, either secondary problems or the substance or the process itself overtakes their life to the point that it's not practical anymore. So if I could take one glass of alcohol a day and feel confident and happy and social, okay, but it won't stay that way for many people, right? So that's part of the challenge. And then once they get into that cycle, it's very, very hard to get out of that cycle. So how that happens might be different slightly in each person. They might have sought out relief. They might have come across it accidentally. But it doesn't matter. I think that's a very fair explanation of the process of what's happening inside the person. So let's say somebody is an addict. Whatever it is, they came to the conclusion they're an addict. So why can't they in some way learn a lot of Mussar and build themselves up and, like Nancy Reagan used to say, right? Just don't do it, right? Say no, right? Why not? What's stopping the person from, we don't want to speak Lashon Hara, we learn Chavis Chaim every day, right? So just do Mussar every day and maybe you won't have to succumb to your immoral, behaviors and practices. So the answer is maybe, right? One of the things that I like to tell people who ask that question is, well, has it worked for you? So if the person says no, I would say why. If the person says I haven't tried it, I said why not try it? Doesn't there's no monopoly. There's no monopoly on how to help people, despite the fact that some of us, including myself, make a parnasa off of that. The fact of the matter is that there's no monopoly on how to help people. So if somebody wants to study Mussar and it helps them, that's great. The only thing is you have to be honest, right? Are you stuck? Because that's the difference, right? What Mussar can offer to a large extent is a very humanistic, a very insightful process, of understanding how humans deal with temptation, engage in spirituality, elevate themselves, all those wonderful things that they really are wonderful. Awareness, mindfulness, all those things, there's a lot of sources, there's a lot of ways to develop that through Mussar. However, I think the difference is ultimately is whether it's working or not. Because sometimes people know full well what they're supposed to do. And they don't have any lack of clarity. They know exactly what's wrong. And they know that they're doing the wrong thing. And they can't help themselves. So, what do you do then? How much more Mussar can you learn? So what does therapy do? What does 12 steps do then? Isn't that the same thing? Aren't you just sitting with somebody, or aren't you just in a group of people telling you what to do, or the therapist telling you what to do? No, the answer is no, and that's what I'd like to clarify, because it's not the same thing at all. It is absolutely not the same thing. 12 steps is not therapy, and therapy is not 12 steps, and neither of them are the experience of Mussar. Yes, there are certain commonalities, because they're all dealing with the amplification of the person's ability to make moral choices and discernment. They're certainly insightful into human nature. They're certainly respectful of human process. However, no, they're not the same, and I want to talk about that very distinctly to help people understand that there are differences. Right? So I think one piece to understand about an addict's life is that oftentimes there is an issue that's out of control in their life, not the addiction. There is something that's out of control in their life that somehow or another the addiction in its own crazy way balances out. So, for example, maybe you have a gentleman who comes from a very prominent family. Of course, these are not real cases, but they're actually very real because they represent the amalgam of hundreds of cases, but this is not anybody real, even if it might shockingly bear some resemblance to somebody who you know. But the point is that imagine a young fellow coming from a very prominent family of learners, and it's expected that he is going to learn in kollel, and he marries from the best families, and he goes to kollel, and his wife is being very dutiful and going off to work and supporting his efforts in Torah, and everything's really amazing. There's only one problem. He really can't stand learning. He just can't stand it. The letters dance on the page. He can't see the words straight. He's bored to tears, but he's got nowhere to go because he's got to, he has to perform. This is his job. This was his expectation. This is who he married. He's supposed to do this. This is his part of the deal. And so he's in an impossible situation. And then one day he's homesick and he's fooling around and he says, I'll just look at one thing. And then what happens is all of a sudden when he's in that place, he's transported to a world where he's powerful, where he gets the sex that he wants, where the people want sex from him, where he can forget about all his problems. That's intoxicating, literally. It's addictive, right? And so every day he gets up later or he comes home earlier for lunch. And then 6, 8 months, 10 months later, his wife finds out that actually half the day he's not even in yeshiva, and she wants to know where he is. And then she finds all this stuff, on the computer or whatever, right? It's not an unusual story because it starts out relatively innocent, and it also starts out with a person who feels themselves to be in an impossible situation. And then they do something else impossible to kind of balance it out in some strange way. Or you can have a person who's working crazy hours, working 14-hour days, 16-hour days, nonstop with all the pressures of family life, and feels, you know what? I deserve a break. I'm working 15, 16 hours, so I'm going to order big Chinese food, and eats. Never gets angry, just eats and eats and eats. And one day he goes to the doctor, and the doctor says, you're not going to live another 10 years like this. You're 150 pounds overweight. And so he tries to quit, or she tries to quit, and she can't. Can't. Because life is impossible, and the food was making life possible. So the point is, I'm not saying that that's the case in every single situation, because I think that human experience is obviously very varied, and no two people are alike. But I'm saying there are certain ideas here that you might see in common in many addicts, which is that they feel themselves, whether or not it's impossible is another story, but they feel themselves to be in an impossible situation. And somehow or another, the addiction process made their situation feel more possible, even though it's equally impossible. It's doubly impossible now. Now you have two problems. You have an impossible addiction, and you have an impossible life, which is why a lot of times addicts in recovery have to do so much rebuilding, because first they got to get sober, and that takes a long time. And then they have to pick up the pieces of a life that they never really had in the first place. And that's why it's so complicated, and that's why sometimes it's easier to live with an addict than it is to live with a recovering addict, because recovering addicts are impossible. Because now, instead of eating their impossibility or ingesting their impossibility, they're living their impossibility, and you got to watch it, and you think to yourself, I think I liked it in the old days. It was a lot easier then, right? So these are very real issues. So the point of, we'll talk about 12 steps, and we'll talk about therapy in a minute, but 12 steps in their own way and therapy in their own way find another approach to the double bind of the impossibility of the addict's life. There's something about their life, there's something about how they're relating to themselves and to the world that is impossible. And Mussar can tell you what to do, but it can't always tell you how to do, right? Like, that, believe it or not, it's just an interesting story about how modern technological advances. I'm sure you all believe that Sifrei Torah are written with a quill, right? But that actually was a technological advance in the 14th century, and it was greeted with great suspicion. They used to use bamboo reeds, and then there was a big advance, and wow, look how much easier the feather works. And so they converted over, and it was a big, it was a controversy halachically. But the wheels of progress grind on, and so we write with quills. But the point is that the halacha doesn't tell you how to do something. The halacha tells you what you should do. The how to do is a part of parenting. It's part of Torah Shebaal Peh. So, Mussar can offer a lot, but it doesn't necessarily help people undo what they need to do. You can learn the entire Hilchos Shabbos, and you still can't tie a knot, bake bread, right, or cook something, even though Hilchos Shabbos is filled with tying knots, baking bread, and cooking something, right? Because there are experiences of humanity that are outside of the Torah. Not that the Torah doesn't have something to say about it, but the human experience of it operates in a different realm. So the Torah can tell you, you can tie a knot this way, and you can't tie a knot that way, and you could cook this way, and you can't cook that way. But it doesn't tell you how to cook. It doesn't tell you how to cook. It doesn't even really tell you how to shecht. It tells you, what makes things treif. So the point we're trying to make is that therapy or 12 steps offer a person a way. They're not offering necessarily a morality, which is a different piece. They offer a way. And it's important to reflect a little bit on how the 12 steps came into being. It was founded by Bill Wilson and Bob Smith. Both of them themselves were very accomplished professionals who also were having their lives destroyed by alcoholism. So Bill Wilson was a law school graduate who never showed up to his graduation because he was drunk, which, that's what we talk about, significant impairment, right? And Dr. Bob Smith, he was a doctor, a medical doctor, and his medical practice was constantly in jeopardy because he'd basically spend his evenings drinking himself. And he'd wake up late and somehow or another managed to still function in some way, but his life was being destroyed. So what happened? They went through, there's a lot of history behind it, but some of the things they began to realize about the cycle, of the addict is the feeling of shame, the belief that you can control things, the self-deception, the sense of entitlement. That's the balancing factor, right? I work so hard, so es kommt zu mir, to allow myself this little treat, whatever that treat would be. Or if my spouse would only stop, yelling at me and nagging me, everything would be just fine, right? That whole sense of evading personal responsibility. And so if you want to look at, and I heard that Lou went through the 12 steps in greater detail, so I won't repeat them too much, only for the sake of illustrating how some of this works on a psychological level, right? Is that, right, the first 3 steps really deal with both a recognition of powerless and also recognition of the fact that a person is not alone, right, and is in it with a higher power, right? Please keep doing that, because I can't hear that I'm not loud. In fact, this is uncomfortably loud for me, which is fine, but you have to keep reminding me, but then it'll be low again. So in any case, so in step 1, it's, we admitted we were powerless over alcohol. And in a way that's counterintuitive. Why would admitting that you're powerless in any way stop you from being addictive? Because it's not that you're powerless to your addiction, it's that you're powerless to alcohol. There's a very big difference, because you don't have to start drinking. But what you have to consider is that for you, maybe not other human beings, but for you, if you pick up that drink, that you will become powerless. And the honesty and the non-rationalization of that, understanding that that is a reality, that there are people that will never be able to function with moderation around certain things. Others might. Like I said, there's nothing inappropriate about a person having a drink at a simcha. I mean, for goodness sake, Chazal did not know what grape juice was. They called grape juice yain chadash, and it was a luxury, and it would spoil very quickly because they didn't have refrigerators. Yain chadash meant that before it started to ferment, straight from the vat, you could have that. And that was not really considered, halachically it's wine, but like it wasn't considered the normal wine. They drank. You make kiddush over wine because you're celebrating Shabbos and you're getting intoxicated, not drop dead drunk, but you're enjoying being high. That's for other people, right? But just like a diabetic can't have sugar, an addict may have to come to the realization that he or she cannot have that substance, that for them there's no such thing as moderation. And the sooner that realization, right, the sooner the bottom hits hard enough that there's no more lies, right, that's the sooner that the addict could come to a place where the work can begin. Because until that, let's not kid ourselves, it's painful to stay away from something that feels good. It's painful, it's depriving. None of us want to be deprived. So that's very important. And then came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity, and made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understood him. This is very important. I'm sure today somebody must have quoted the Gemara in Kedushin about the Yetzer Hara. Nobody did? Oh, well, here we go. Look at that. Again, I don't have to tell jokes. Okay, so it says, this is on Lamed Amud Beis, Amar Rav Shimon ben Levi, said Rav Shimon, the son of Levi, Yitzro Shalad Miskaber of the Chol Yom, the inclination of a man, meaning here a human being, it's not referring to a man alone, human being tries to overcome him every day, umavakesh hamiso, and wants to kill him. V'ilmalei HaKadosh Baruch Hu ozrehu, if not for the fact that Hashem would help him, ein yacholo, he could not succeed against it. So that's a pretty clear stating of the third step, right? The second step, came to believe that a power greater than ourselves can restore us to sanity. So it's very interesting. Another thing about this message is acceptance. Addicts are known to have serious issues with control. That doesn't mean every controlling person is an addict, because the converse of things are not always true. But addicts are known to have some very serious issues with control. And part of that is the idea that you can't accept reality as it is. You're in an impossible situation. You don't like your life. You don't want to accept it. You want to be somewhere else. But there's a saying, by the way, the 12-step community has the best sayings. Like, here's one. How's it go? Just be yourself because everybody else is taken already. Oh, half-flavor fella, right? Is that unbelievable? Such a great line. I sign all my emails with the statement, with also 12-step adage. It ends with, it says, have a great day, unless, of course, you made other plans. Oh. Ingenious. Think about that. One sentence, and it's like, with Hillel, the Kol, Torah, Kul, in one sentence, your whole life is in your hands, right? You can have a good day if that's what you really want to have, right? Anyway, it's very interesting. The point is, there's a lot of collected wisdom over many, many years of people that sincerely and truly went into the 12-step program. And I have to tell you also, this is just, a personal point. If you are considering going to a 12-step meeting, go to an AA meeting, okay? Because Alcoholics Anonymous has, so to speak, Lahavdil, the oldest Mussar. And some of these guys, the ones that have been sober for 30, 40 years, these guys, they're like Dolim. You hear them speak, and you gotta go, I shot my girlfriend 30 years ago, was in jail for another 20 years, and now I get on the floor and pray to God 4 times a day. And these guys are serious. They rebuilt their lives from nothing. They destroyed their lives completely. They destroyed everybody who they know. Their children hate them. Their 6 wives divorced them. They have, they lost their careers. They lost their medical licenses. They lost everything. And they're sober for 30 years, and they rebuilt their life from mamish nothing. And you have to listen to some of those people. They really, really are gedolim. I know it sounds strange, but I'm telling you that if you're going to already go to a meeting and you want to hear something, go to an AA meeting. It's something else if you hear one of the old-timers speak. It's really, really something else. To see people that are so spiritual, and literally they walk with God every minute, because they have learned that if they don't do that, they're not going to be alive. They learned it the hard way, but they learned it. Anyway, which brings me to this point of acceptance. That's a very, very powerful notion, and it actually exists in a lot of spiritual traditions. Acceptance. It's amongst the Hasidic Ashkenaz, which has nothing to do with Hasidim of the 18th century. We're talking about back in Germany and other places like where the Balei Tosfos lived. They had a thing called hishtavus, which means, in English, equanimity. It means the ability to take things in stride. Not to be not invested, just not to be over-invested. The Amish have something I think called Getzelheit or something. I'm not sure if I remember the word correctly, but it's a similar Midas thing. There's a Zen Parable, which is an interesting version of a Gamzu Torah story, but it's a Gamzu Tova story, but it's a little different. So there's this farmer, right? And a wild stallion lands on his farm. And so his neighbors come and congratulate him at this great find because it's a beautiful, magnificent horse, and he basically got it for free, And in those days, right? I mean, a horse is like a Lexus, right? A big stallion. It's worth a lot of money. It's everything you need. So his neighbors come and congratulate him, and he shrugs. He says, "Okay, we'll see." And then his son, trying to break in the horse, falls off the horse and breaks his leg. And so his neighbors all come and give him, condolences and say, "Oh, it's so terrible. What happened? It's so awful." And he goes, We'll see what it'll be." And then the army comes in to draft and conscript people of the town, because there's a war going on, and they can't draft his son because his son has a broken leg. And so all the other young men in the town are taken away except for him. So the neighbors come again and say, "Wow, amazing, congratulations." And he goes, "We'll see." Right? So it's an interesting twist on the Gamzu Tova story, because the Gamzu Tova story, which is also true, right, it wraps it up very neatly, that the person sees immediately. Rabbi Akiva, he saw, in that famous Gemara, he saw that all those things that happened to him were for a purpose. So there's a Gemara in Nidan Laman Aleph where a guy misses a boat, he stubs his toe, misses the boat, and then he finds out that the boat sank, right? So those are great stories because you walk away immediately with the feeling that there was a happy ending, or you walk away immediately with the feeling, "Oh, Gamzu Tova." But this message is a little deeper. This is Hishtavas. This is saying, you know what? You don't really know. You just don't really know. And that, of course, you're a human being. You can grieve and you could rejoice, but don't take it so seriously, right? Don't assume that you can control everything and manage everything. So that midah of Hishtavas is a big part of the recovery, the spirit of recovery. If you read the 12 steps, it's about acceptance. It's about being able to deal with reality and not trying to make reality different than it is. It's, you have to accept your resentments against others and your own part in it. And so many other pieces of that rubric that bring to a person a certain sense of acceptance. So the other big piece that's very, very hard is shame. Shame in the addiction cycle is kind of a hand-in-hand piece, because the addict will do something because they're feeling low, in pain, and then they'll feel shame for what they do because they realize if everybody knew that I was doing this horrible, shameful thing, they would really despise me. And so then they feel more shame, and then they end up doing more of their addiction, and then they feel more shame, and then they do more of their addiction, right? And so part of the 12-step fellowship is a person going through a process where there are people around him that openly, talk about their flaws and talk about their struggles and provide acceptance. Social acceptance is visceral. We are hardwired to care about what other people think. Social rejection, if you take an MRI of a person, a functional MRI of a person experiencing social rejection, it will show up in the brain the same as someone experiencing acute physical pain. And there's a very important reason for that, because it is a matter of life and death. Not in the modern world, but in the human body. Imagine you're a hunter. If your clansmen don't care about you enough to pick you up when you fall or give you an extra piece of meat when you're not feeling well, you're going to die, right? So being accepted by your peer group is a matter of life and death. And even though in the modern world that's less relevant to us because we have all kinds of social niceties and we have all kinds of security nets, but we can't stop what we really are wired for. And we're wired to really, really, really care about what people think. And so feeling not connected, feeling different from everybody else, feeling ashamed of who you are is terribly, viscerally painful. And when an addict is part of a fellowship, when there's a whole room of people, when there's a sponsor, when there's a whole group of people that you could reach out to who say that I am like you and you are like me and we are part of a group, and even though we're struggling, we're okay. It's not okay what we did, because no 12-step group is going to tell somebody that, but you are okay. That's very, very powerful. That's like a glass of water to a thirsty, starving person. And so that fellowship is extremely powerful. There's a researcher, Pennebaker, who did a research on trauma, and it's fascinating. He asked people 2 questions. Question number 1, did you experience a traumatic event in your life sometime before the age of 18? That was question number 1 on the questionnaire. Question number 2 on the questionnaire was, did you disclose it to anyone? Okay, so question number 1, did you have a trauma in your life before you're 18? Question number 2 is, did you disclose it? So there was an incredible positive correlation between the people that reported experiencing a trauma in their life who did not disclose the trauma. They had diabetes, high blood pressure, heart disease, addictions, and all kinds of other ailments. And here's the real clincher. The people that disclosed, remember, no one knows where this is going. This is just a survey, right? The purpose of the survey wasn't clear to the people who are, answering the question. So the people that disclosed, they were much more protected and much less incidence of all those issues. So again, the problem with research is that you can't really know for sure what the reason is. You only know what is. However, it leads one very strongly to assume that shame is extremely toxic, right? That living in a constant state of not feeling accepted, not feeling a part of your community, feeling that you're doing heinous and despicable acts, right, can really, really wear away at a person. So again, the 12-step fellowship works in some way to help the person come to a different relationship with themselves and with their feelings. And this is just an example. I'm not claiming, that I understand fully, right, how they work too, because it works. It doesn't necessarily tell you how it works. But I think these are fairly reasonable insights. Now, therapy is a little bit different. Therapy addresses shame and developmental problems and trauma in a very different way. And of course, I'm speaking in a general way. There are also different modalities of therapy that do things somewhat differently. But there are certain truisms. Number 1, most therapeutic relationships, not all, but most therapeutic relationships involve a consistent, reliable, non-judgmental, attuned listener. I think that's fair to say. Even someone who's engaged in cognitive behavioral therapy, which is the least psychoanalytic and psychodynamic and least developmental of different therapies, which is not to say that it isn't helpful. I'm just saying in terms of its process, it's not looking as inward as some other kinds of therapies, and it's not cognitive behavioral therapy. I'm not in any way diminishing its effectiveness or leveling critique. I'm just simply saying that the process is more about learning and unlearning certain behaviors than it is about a relationship or about a feeling. But even that, the best cognitive behavioral therapists have a superb rapport with their clients. If they didn't, they wouldn't be able to do anything. And whether they do it intuitively or they study that or they develop their own techniques, the fact of the matter is that one of the key things is that human growth and development happens in the context of a caring relationship. And that's something that it's like, it doesn't matter why, it just is. It's like saying, why do you need to hold a crying baby? And the famous, everybody who takes Psychology 101 knows the famous study of analytic depression after World War II. They had a lot of babies that were basically orphans. And they took these babies in and they fed them and they changed them, but they didn't hold them. They couldn't. There were hundreds of babies and a couple of caretakers. And many of the babies failed to thrive and died just from not being held. just for not being held. They were given adequate nutrition, and they were taken care of physically, but not emotionally. And that's called analytic depression. But the point is that there are certain processes that are human. It doesn't matter why. It just is. I was working with a couple once, and the wife said to the husband, "I want you to say you love me." And he said, "Well, I said that yesterday already." So I said, "Well, funny thing, I ate yesterday and went to sleep yesterday. I don't know why I need to do it again today." You understand? Because it's a process. It's not a quanta. It's a process. Humans need love. And so human beings grow and they develop through the context of a caring relationship. So that's right. And of course, where does that happen? Primarily, hopefully, in a nice functional family, right? But if you're an adult and you're stuck on something, you're stuck in a sense of shame, or you have a trauma that you can't face and it's tormenting you, no one can do it for you. You know, all of medicine really, right? It's not about actually curing somebody, right? It's about activating the body in a way that it's able to cure itself, right? When someone has a broken leg, the doctor does not attach the leg, except if it's so broken they have to put in pins, right? But even after that, it's just putting the bone in place so that the body can do what it does normally, which is mend bone, right? When you take antibiotics, so far, those are not little nanobots going through your bloodstream eating up the infection. Somehow or another, different chemicals seem to stimulate the immune system to respond in a certain way. And by the way, chemotherapies work that way too, that they in different ways act metabolistically on the cancer cells. Unfortunately, they act on regular cells too, which is why it can be so difficult. But the point is that we are not healing somebody. We are putting people in a position where they can heal. And that's very different. Right? So therapy, whatever you're going to do, and there's plenty of things that you need to do if you're a therapist, and I can't get into all of it. What I could say is as follows, that it provides a developmental context where the person can, with a lot less shame and a lot less fear, focus on their pain and focus on constructive ways that they would like to deal with that pain. And doing that in the presence of a caring other is far more effective than doing it alone. And it doesn't matter why. Just like it doesn't matter why a kiss makes a boo-boo better. But it does, right? We know that. So that cannot be dismissed or written away or given over to a computer. There is something very powerful about that process. And it's really worth just meditating on that. Now, a couple of other issues too, in terms of addiction, and this relates to both 12 steps and therapy, each in their own way. But self-control and delay of gratification is an extremely important life skill, and it's really a developmental skill. So you might have heard of the famous Marshmallow Experiment. Yeah, so in the 1960s, the psychologist Walter Mischel devised a very interesting test. They would give preschoolers a plate with a chocolate-covered marshmallow. And they were told, if you do not eat this marshmallow now, we're going to walk out of the room, if you do not eat this marshmallow now, when I come back, you will get 2 marshmallows. It's a pretty simple equation, right? So they were video recording, secretly what different kids did. Some kids didn't eat the marshmallows. Some kids, gobbled it in one shot. Some kids took a lick, said, I'll just have a little bit, and then gobbled it. Sound familiar? In any case, what he found was, 20 years later, the children that held out, we're talking about preschoolers, we're talking about 4-year-olds. The children that held out and didn't eat the marshmallow and got the 2 marshmallows, those children later had statistically significant and dramatic reduction in divorce, obesity, substance abuse, and having graduate degrees. So here's a scary thought, right? You know the saying, everything I needed to learn, I learned in kindergarten? That's a little scary, right? That skill, right, of delay of gratification, of being able to keep in mind the big picture and resisting the temptation of the moment is so fundamental and so predictive that the children that had it at 4 had a heads up for the rest of their lives. It's a little scary, a little depressing too, I would say. It's never too late though. That's one thing about neuroplasticity, by the way. They used to think that everything, was fixed, and studies today really show that the brain, yes, a child's brain is definitely more neuroplastic and responds more quickly to change. But they've done experiments where they've really been able to prove how the brain adapts even at later age. So there's a famous experiment about London cabbies. Now, in London, the streets are very Byzantine and crooked, and in order to be a cabbie, you have to pass a test where they give you different questions about how to get from point A and point B in London, and you can't just get it right, you have to get the shortest way. So you have to have the map of London in your head. And here's the fascinating thing. Even cabbies who became cabbies later on in life, in their 40s, when they took an MRI at the beginning of their year, and then after a year of driving around London, the part of the brain that's responsible for spatial equations expanded. So the brain is plastic. So, there is hope. Even if we were the ones that would have had the marshmallow, just to let you know, it's not fate, although it is important. And so as parents in one way, working in 12 steps in another way, therapists in another way, we have a big responsibility to help develop within our children, and even within ourselves, the ability to delay gratification and impulse control. And how do you do that? Right? How do you do that? Well, there's a concept in developmental psychology called scaffolding, which is that human development happens best when it's in the sweet spot. The sweet spot is where it's not too hard and it's not too easy. Okay? And if you think about it, it's like a scaffold. Like when you're building a building, you prop it up until you finish, and then you take away the scaffold, right? So, when you're trying to do something, right, if it's too easy, you don't try. If it's too hard, right, you give up, right? And a good parent finds ways to put children within, it's called their zone of proximal development. A Russian psychologist, Vygotsky, I think, named that. But it's a zone of proximal development where they're appropriately challenged. And this is a very important task of parenting, right? Not to be helicopter parents and give children, everything and no chance to be exposed to risk. And obviously not to throw them out into traffic. Here, kid, go play, learn how to ride your bike. Right? That's not going to go well, right? But the idea is to put in front of children appropriate challenges and let them wrestle with it, let them make mistakes, let them deal with the consequences of mistakes that are not epic and tragic, right? So your child is delaying doing homework. So you're going to chase your child 6 times a night to do the homework, or say, the homework is something that it's between you and your teacher. I would advise you to take care of it right away, but I suppose if you don't, it might create some problems. Now, I'm not saying that it's wonderful if a child doesn't do homework and gets a poor grade, but those are age-appropriate challenges that children should deal with and grapple with in some way. Yes, you could coach, you could offer some guidance, but they have to be appropriately challenged to manage their time, to manage their lives, to delay gratification. Is it really helpful, for a 6th grader to say, well, you can't play a video game unless you do your homework. Don't you think a 6th grader should be able to figure that out on their own? Maybe they don't. Maybe they can't. But I'm just saying that's part of good parenting. Obviously, each child is different. Every parent is different. But delay of gratification and self-control is directly tied to the idea of scaffolding, because you want to build up within the child that experience. I just want to end with a comment, and then I'll see if we're allowed to take questions. No, we are not allowed to take questions. Well, you always could email me if you want to. It's my name, simchafeuerman@gmail.com. By the way, I will be selling some of my books if you want. You could buy them. I'll be around afterwards, so my emails and my books too. But in any case, I just want to end with one little thought, which is that you could take the horse to water, but you can't make him say Tashlach. Thank you all.